When we think about medieval soldiers, the first images that come to mind are usually epic battles, noble knights in shining armor, and tales of honor, bravery, and loyalty. We've seen it in movies, heard it in legends, and read it in books. But behind the romantic stories and heroic myths lies a much harsher, dirtier, and more disturbing reality. Medieval warfare wasn't all glory. It was filled with suffering, fear, betrayal, and brutal survival. The life of a soldier in the Middle Ages was nothing like the chivalric dream we often imagine. What really went on in the mud, blood, and chaos of medieval battlefields will change the way you see this era forever. These are the 7 brutal truths about medieval soldiers you were never taught in school. Number 1. Training was a luxury. When we picture medieval soldiers, the common image that comes to mind is that of skilled warriors, battle-hardened and highly disciplined, effortlessly wielding swords or lances with precision. But this polished version of history is far from the truth. The reality on the ground was much grimmer, especially for those who didn't belong to the upper classes. Most medieval soldiers weren't raised on tales of glory and battlefield honor. They were poor men with little choice, drafted into service by their local lords or rulers with almost no preparation. For knights, yes, there was a structured path that began in youth. A noble boy might start training around the age of 7, first serving as a page, then progressing to the role of squire. This training included horseback riding, learning how to handle a sword, and even reading or studying religious texts. But while this sounds thorough on the surface, it often lacked real battlefield experience. Many young nobles were taught more about how to behave like a knight, courtly manners, rituals, and symbols, than how to survive in the chaos of combat. And their instructors? Often older warriors stuck in old habits, passing down tradition more than practical tactics. Now shift your focus to the majority, the foot soldiers, the backbone of any army. These were peasants, farmers, tradesmen, men who might have held a hoe or hammer all their lives, and were suddenly handed a spear or dull sword and told to march into battle. There was no boot camp, no drills, no time to learn how to defend themselves properly. These levied men weren't soldiers by profession. They were disposable bodies, meant to fill the ranks and soak up damage. The lack of formal training made coordination nearly impossible. Troops rarely practiced formations or battlefield communication. Signals could be misread, commands shouted over the noise would vanish in the chaos, and discipline crumbled the moment things went wrong. Even elite forces had their issues. Knights, with all their gear and titles, often charged in for personal glory rather than obeying coordinated strategies. In short, medieval warfare was more about raw instinct and brute force than calculated professional combat. Training, if you got any, was minimal and inconsistent. Most soldiers learned how to fight not from structured lessons, but by watching the man next to them die, hoping to last a little longer themselves. Number 2, armor was a double-edged sword. When people imagine a medieval battlefield, one of the first images that comes to mind is a fully armored knight, gleaming in the sunlight, towering above the chaos and shrugging off every blow. That image, while iconic, doesn't tell the whole story. Yes, armor was a major advancement in personal protection, but it also brought a range of problems that soldiers had to endure every time they put it on. Armor was not something you casually threw over your shoulders. It was heavy, restrictive, and only accessible to a privileged few who could afford it or inherit it. The average soldier had no hope of obtaining a full suit of plate armor. Instead, most had to make do with partial protection, maybe a chainmail hauberk if they were lucky, a simple iron helmet, or a patched-up breastplate passed down through generations. These makeshift setups left large areas of the body exposed, forcing many to rely more on agility or positioning than actual physical defense. Even those few who did march into battle covered head to toe in metal weren't guaranteed safety. The human body can only handle so much, and when encased in the layers of steel or iron, the heat became suffocating, especially during summer campaigns or under the midday sun. The strain of carrying armor wasn't just about the weight. It altered how you moved, how long you could fight, and how quickly you could respond. While it's true that a trained knight could run, ride, and swing a sword in full armor, the issue came down to stamina. Long battles drained energy quickly, and the soldier inside that impressive shell often found themselves exhausted after short bursts of intense fighting. Every movement took more effort, and breathing became harder when heart rate and body temperature soared inside the sealed helmet. Then there was the psychological aspect. Falling in armor, especially during the chaos of close combat, was a terrifying thought. With your limbs restricted and vision narrowed by your visor, the risk of being pinned or trampled was very real. And while armor could turn blades or arrows, it didn't stop the sheer force behind heavier weapons. Blunt force tools like hammers or maces weren't just used for show. They were created specifically to bypass armor not by piercing it, but by crushing the bones beneath it. In this sense, armor offered protection, yes, but it also made its wearer a specific kind of target, one that required a particular brutal kind of attention. Number 3, food. Was worse than you think. When medieval armies went to war, they didn't march with organized supply wagons filled with nutritious meals. The very concept of military logistics as we understand it today didn't exist. Soldiers were expected to fend for themselves or rely on whatever their commanders could scrape together. The result was a chaotic and unreliable food situation that left many men underfed, constantly hungry, and vulnerable to illness long before they faced any enemy blade. Most provisions were simple, dry, and barely palatable. Hard biscuits, tough as stone unless soaked in liquid, were a staple. Salted meat, often tough and riddled with fat or gristle, was brought along in slabs. If soldiers had access to legumes or oats, it was considered a luxury. Fresh produce was almost non-existent. Storage methods were crude at best, with sacks or barrels that offered little protection from mold, insects, or spoilage. During the warmer months especially, food turned bad quickly. There were no preservatives, no refrigeration, and no second chances if the supplies rotted. The stench of decaying food would often fill the camp, mixing with sweat, blood, and waste. Water posed its own problems. Safe drinking sources were nearly impossible to guarantee. Rivers and streams, which seemed clean at first glance, were often shared with animals, or tainted by human waste and the bodies of the dead. Wells, when available, were shallow and easily contaminated. Boiling water to purify it wasn't a regular practice. The understanding of disease and hygiene simply didn't exist, which meant outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other deadly illnesses were a regular part of military life. Soldiers spent as much time doubled over in pain or battling fever as they did sharpening swords. The longer a campaign dragged on, the worse things got. Horses, once essential for transport and battle, often ended up on the menu when desperation set in. In the coldest months, food froze solid. In the hottest, it rotted in hours. Starvation led to madness. Raiding nearby villages, looting supply caravans, or even stealing from comrades became normal behavior. In some of the worst cases, soldiers turned violent against their own units, driven by nothing more than the gnawing in their stomachs. What's often left out of heroic stories is this grim reality. Many medieval warriors never fought a single enemy because they were already broken down, physically wrecked by disease, weakened by hunger, and drained of energy, long before they ever arrived on the battlefield. Number 4. Death wasn't always quick or glorious. The way medieval combat is portrayed in films, clean sword strikes, elegant duels, and swift deaths, couldn't be further from what actually happened on the battlefield. Real medieval warfare was messy, chaotic, and horrifyingly violent. Death didn't come like a dramatic moment in a story. More often than not, it was drawn out, painful, and deeply humiliating. There was no artistry to the killing, only raw survival and brute force. Weapons were built with one purpose: to destroy the human body in the most effective way possible. Blades dulled quickly, and when they failed to slice, they hacked. Polearms with hooked ends were used to pull riders from horses or rip into flesh with a jerking motion. Maces and warhammers didn't need to pierce. They crushed skulls, shattered ribs, and left soldiers choking on their own blood. A halberd didn't just strike, it mutilated. Even surviving an initial blow didn't guarantee anything. You might collapse with a deep wound that went untreated for hours or days, screaming in agony without relief. The medical knowledge at the time was rudimentary and, by today's standards, terrifying. Battlefield surgeons often operated with dirty hands and reused instruments. There was no understanding of bacteria, no concept of sterilization, and no way to ease pain besides alcohol or biting down on a rag. Amputations were done in a matter of minutes, not for speed, but out of necessity. Soldiers who suffered shattered limbs had to endure crude sawing, often awake, while several men pinned them down. Many didn't survive the operation. Blood loss and shock took countless lives before infection even had the chance. But the worst fate often belonged to the wounded left behind. After the clash ended and armies withdrew or pursued each other, injured men were stranded, bleeding, begging, crawling through mud. Some were looted by their own comrades, others by scavengers who picked through corpses for weapons and gear. Wild animals were a real threat, and so was exposure. In the cold, men froze slowly. In the heat, they died from dehydration or lay under the sun until delirium set in. There was no dignity in these endings. Many who marched out with dreams of honor and divine favor found themselves alone, dying slowly in a ditch, their names never remembered, and their suffering never sung. This was the reality behind the myth of glorious death in medieval war. Not noble, not swift, but savage and forgotten. Number 5. Most soldiers didn't fight for glory. The romantic image of the medieval warrior, sword raised high and heart full of loyalty, is a comforting illusion. Tales passed down through time love to frame these men as defenders of justice or champions of faith. But the truth was far more grounded and far less noble. The overwhelming majority of those who took up arms in the Middle Ages did so not out of principle, but because they were left with no other option. For countless peasants, war was simply another form of survival, not a choice inspired by honor or patriotism. When a feudal lord called upon his subjects, refusal wasn't on the table. Men from villages and farms were pulled from their homes and handed weapons they'd never seen before. These were not warriors in spirit or training, they were laborers, shepherds, and blacksmiths. Fighting was a duty thrust upon them, often under threat of land seizure, fines, or execution. They didn't march into battle with glory in mind. They thought about staying alive long enough to see their families again, if they had any. Mercenaries added a different dynamic altogether. These were men who chose violence as their trade, but not out of devotion. Their motivations were cold and transactional: silver, gold, or food. Loyalty meant little when payment came from multiple directions. Some mercenary bands switched sides mid-campaign if the opposing lord offered a better deal. Their reputations were brutal. They were known for pillaging, extorting, and showing no hesitation when things turned bloody. For them, war wasn't a calling, it was business. Even among knights, supposedly the embodiment of chivalry and Christian virtue, the lines between duty and self-interest blurred quickly. Many knights sought reputation through sheer dominance, not moral deeds. Raiding enemy settlements, holding prisoners for ransom, and carving out influence through force were standard practices. Their so-called codes of honor often applied only when convenient, and rarely extended to the common people who bore the brunt of their campaigns. The idea that soldiers fought for honor and righteousness came from the stories written afterward, by poets, chroniclers, and nobles who weren't there when the blood soaked the dirt. In reality, medieval war was a transaction, a struggle, or a trap. The average soldier didn't dream of banners and hymns. He wanted enough coin to eat, enough strength to return home, and enough luck not to end up face down in the mud. Number 6. Sieges were a nightmare for everyone. When most people think of castles under siege, they imagine towering stone walls, boiling oil poured from battlements, and valiant defenders holding strong against enemy waves. But the harsh truth behind medieval sieges was far more gruesome and far less heroic. These weren't short, sharp battles. They were long, draining, and devastating campaigns that crushed spirits, drained resources, and punished both sides in ways that often left scars deeper than any sword could inflict. Inside the walls, desperation set in faster than many realize. Fortified towns and castles weren't built to sustain thousands of people for extended periods without fresh supplies. Once the gates were sealed and surrounding farmlands were cut off, panic crept in. Granaries emptied day by day, and whatever food remained was rationed to the brink of starvation. Bread turned to mold, meat ran rancid, and people began boiling leather or eating whatever rodents they could catch. The rich might hoard, but the poor suffered visibly, growing thinner with each passing week. Disease didn't need much of an invitation. Overcrowded spaces, limited sanitation, and stagnant water supplies created the perfect breeding ground for illness. Wounds went untreated, filth piled up in the streets, and the smell of sickness became a constant companion. Children cried from hunger. Old men died quietly in corners. Civilians blamed the garrison. Soldiers blamed the townsfolk. Fear turned to frustration, and frustration to unrest. On the outside, life wasn't better. The besieging army was far from comfortable. Exposure to the elements meant freezing nights or burning days, with little protection beyond tents or makeshift shelters. Supplies had to be hauled from distant locations, and the threat of enemy reinforcements loomed constantly. Digging siege tunnels or operating trebuchets wasn't just laborious, it was dangerous. Collapses, counterattacks, and accidents were frequent. Morale could sink fast, especially when no progress was visible. Some soldiers deserted. Others turned to looting nearby villages to stave off boredom and hunger. Psychological warfare became a brutal tactic. Defenders hurled corpses, severed heads, or disease-ridden waste over the walls, trying to break the spirit of the attackers. In return, besiegers catapulted fireballs, mutilated hostages, or used noise and fear to keep tension high. It was a waiting game, one that eroded sanity more than strength. And when the walls finally fell, the suffering peaked. The victors, filled with rage or seeking revenge, often unleashed horrors, mass killings, brutal assaults, and the total destruction of homes and lives. In the end, sieges left no one untouched. Survivors were marked forever, not just by what they endured, but by what they witnessed in the slow, suffocating grind of a war with no clean escape. Number 7. Brotherhood was fragile. The idea of medieval warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, bound by trust and camaraderie, is a romantic vision that rarely survived contact with reality. While stories love to portray small bands of brothers-in-arms united by loyalty and shared suffering, actual medieval armies were far less cohesive. The fabric holding them together was stretched thin, made up of fragile alliances, class divisions, and personal ambitions that often clashed more than they aligned. Loyalty had limits, and those limits were tested constantly on the road, in camp, and in the heat of battle. Medieval armies weren't uniform. They were a volatile mix of different groups, each with their own expectations and grievances. Nobles marched with a sense of entitlement, commanding respect simply by birthright. Peasants, often forced into service, resented their treatment and carried out orders with bitterness. Mercenaries, who made up a significant portion of many armies, cared for little beyond their pay and loot. That alone created a toxic atmosphere where class resentment, mistrust, and conflict were always simmering just beneath the surface. Tensions flared frequently. Disputes over stolen goods, unequal food rations, or missed payments turned into shouting matches that could spiral into open violence. Camps were dangerous not just because of the enemy outside the walls, but because tempers inside could ignite over the smallest spark. Brawls broke out in the dead of night, and grudges lasted longer than any campaign. Commanders often struggled to maintain control, not because of the enemy, but because their men simply didn't trust one another. Envy and rivalry spread even among those who trained together. The notion of shared loyalty crumbled under pressure. When the tide of battle shifted and panic set in, Many soldiers abandoned their comrades without hesitation. During chaotic retreats, discipline collapsed, and it became a matter of self-preservation. Soldiers scavenged from the dead, including their own allies, and those who couldn't keep up were left behind without a second thought. Acts of betrayal weren't rare, they were part of the reality. Knights competed for favor, sometimes sabotaging others to gain recognition or land. Even those sworn to religious or military orders were not immune to jealousy and backstabbing. In this brutal environment, trust was a gamble. Bonds could form, but they were often temporary and born of necessity, not affection. War didn't just test courage, it tested character. And in the chaos of medieval conflict, the line between ally and enemy could shift with frightening ease. Brotherhood wasn't a constant, it was conditional, and often it shattered under the weight of fear, ambition, and desperation.